So important to understand this because it's very badly misunderstood. Article 5 does not mean if one country is attacked, everybody else is at war. What it means is if each country is attacked, it will be considered as an attack on all. And then this is the part where almost nobody ever goes and are unaware. It's literally specifically written into the Washington Treaty that set up NATO. Each country's parliaments and governments will then decide for themselves what they should do. Maybe they will provide verbal support. Maybe they will provide emotional support. Maybe they will provide ammunition. Maybe they will go on the ground and fight, etc. All those things have to be decided each individual country. So I suspect you'll probably get something like this. And probably Russia says, okay, as long as there are no enforcement mechanisms as part of these so-called guarantees, and you're going to just kind of have consultations and you're going to meet and discuss it and you'll wag your finger in our face if something bad happens to something, then they can agree. Because it's just really hard for me to imagine. I can't preclude anything. I'm not inside the Russian decision-making apparatus, so I don't know what their thought process is, but I cannot imagine any scenario whereby they would say, sure, you can have security guarantees with whatever end of war negotiations come out so that there will be a war with us, with Russia, and we'll agree to this ahead of time. I just can't imagine that they would say that. I think that the likelihood is that this is just going to be more words, the very thing that Zelensky frankly claimed that he was concerned about. And that's just the rib, because that's just the hardcore reality. Nobody is going to go to war for Ukraine against nuclear-armed Russia. Understand that heading in. So then the question is, though, what is going to happen? What is possible? Because something has to change. Otherwise, we're just left with the continuation of the war where we are. And let's take now a look at the Russian side and where they are with this. We've talked to you several times in just the last few days about what the Russians said after the Alaska meeting and how they want to see this war come to an end. They're willing to have negotiated settlement, but they said they are still where they were on the June 14, 2024 lines. So to reinforce people to understand heading into this meeting where the Russian mentality is, because they keep referring to that, and then a couple of other things that have already been said here, I think you get a really good idea of where Russia will enter this. So whatever is decided today by the two meetings in Washington, it's going to have to match up in some way with stuff like this.
The essence of our proposal is not some kind of temporary truce or suspension of fire, as, for example, the West wants. This is not about freezing the conflict, but about its final completion. And I will say again, as soon as Kiev agrees to a similar course of events proposed today, agrees to the complete withdrawal of its troops from the DPR and LPR in the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions, and really begins this process, we are ready to begin negotiations without delaying them. I repeat, this is our principled position. Neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free status of Ukraine, its demilitarization and denazification.
I mean, he said it all right there, and I mean, almost about those last 7 or 8 seconds. Demilitarization, denuclearization, no NATO, demilitarization. All of those things have to happen, and they get all 4 territories that they have. The Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Luhansk, and Donetsk. And of course, Crimea is not even on the table to Russians. That's already a past tense. So they have to have all the administrative borders. Subsequently, they specified all the administrative borders. Ergo, Ukraine will have to withdraw, especially from the southern 3, where they have substantial portions of those provinces still under their military control. They would have to physically, intentionally, willingly withdraw from all of those. Now, apparently what was discussed with Trump last week in Alaska was that immediately the first thing that would have to happen was that the northern 2 in all of Donetsk and Luhansk, all of that would have to be withdrawn. They would freeze the southern part of that current line of contact, and then they would continue on with discussions along with a lot of other situations that they would be still willing to discuss a ceasefire as long as it included things like a freeze on any Western supplies to the Ukraine, a freeze on anybody else being mobilized into the war. In other words, the Ukraine side can't use this as a respite to rush more troops in, because some of the European sources are saying, and what we would want immediately is to send European NATO, European so-called peacekeeping troops into there, this coalition of the willing. That's what a lot of them are still talking about too. Russia says, no, that's not even on the table for discussion. And in fact, let me show you a couple of other things. That was in June 2024. Here is a short clip of Putin and Lavrov in December, right around Christmas time, reinforcing some of these points.
What we need is not just a ceasefire, we need peace, a long-lasting peace.
We cannot be satisfied with empty talk. So far, all we've heard is talk about the need to come up with some kind of truce. And it's not particularly hidden that this truce is needed in order to gain time to continue pumping weapons into Ukraine. A truce is a road to nowhere.
And they've never changed that. And they have, by what we've heard from reporting on both the Russian and American side, that was reiterated in Alaska. We're still not interested or willing to even contemplate a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. They're only as willing to be a ceasefire with big conditions. So that's what the Russians are telling the American side here. Now, if Russia, the key question that has to be answered here today is if Trump can't get anybody to come to his side, meaning Ukraine or Europe, and there is no deal or no agreement on the Western side, where does that leave us? Well, that's going to leave us with the war continuing on. And Russian Ambassador Novenzia in the UN Security Council last May very plainly stated Russia's position, which has not changed since.
President, we've said and want to repeat that the objective of our special military operation can be achieved through peaceful or military means. Our armed forces stand ready to continue stepping up their military activities insofar as is necessary.
So he said that Lavrov has said it directly. Putin himself has implied it. He's rarely directive in what he talks about in front. But they have all unified said this. We will either win with negotiate. We will either achieve our objectives in this, what they call a special military operation, at the negotiating table. And that's why they went to Alaska. That's why they're willing to talk in something after this, or we'll win it on the battlefield. We'll either negotiate it or take it. That is the Russian position. So the question is, what can they do? What can't they do? What can the Western position writ large do? What can't it do? Because the statements coming by the two sides remain off the charts. I mean, you can't even see them on my screen. They're so far apart. They haven't been narrowed in the least. The only thing, and again, you know that I find criticism with a number of things President Trump does, but one of the things he gets my full-throated support on is this issue here. He alone is the only person in the Western world with any kind of power that is interested in, willing, and desirous to end the war through negotiations. Now, whether he's going to succeed or not, we're going to find out in large measure by the end of this day, I would imagine. But good on him for trying. And I hope that he remains firm, because he does have the capacity and the power to compel this one way or another. We'll see what he has to do based on what happens, what he can and can't get the Western leaders to do. And by the way, Trump this is a huge high stakes gamble, not just for Ukraine, though they're the biggest ones because of the physical life and death issue, but politically, this is a massive high stakes issue for President Trump himself. Because he's got, in my view, one narrow path to success here. And if he succeeds, almost guaranteed he's going to get the Nobel Peace Prize. I would endorse it if he was able to pull this off, as hard as it would be. But it's going to be really, really hard. And that one narrow path is that he gets through coercion or whatever he can do behind the scenes with the European Union, all those European leaders who are there today. I think it's very clear they are all there in number, in person, not the VTC, not a video teleconference, because they want to in person impress upon and pressure Trump to not do what he wants and to compel him to come to their side. Guaranteed that's what's going on. That's why they're physically here. And of course, obviously, Zelensky's wanting the same thing. And that's why he loves all the artillery backup, so to speak, with the European leaders. If Trump can compel that whole group to agree to the minimum terms that the Putin administration will agree to, then we will have a chance to see this war come to an end. And Trump is right in his Truth Social. Zelensky could make decisions that could bring this war to a very, very quick outcome. That at least is a possibility. Unfortunately, I give it just a sliver of a possibility, but it does remain there, and the one that I am the most eager to see happen here. I know that will make so many people in the West angry and upset and talking about how this is laying the foundation for another war, and it may work out that way. I certainly can't say that that's not going to happen, because when people want war, they will damn sure find a way to get it. And if you don't want to find peace, and let me just kind of preach a little bit here, a bit to this mentality that so many in the West have, they don't want any kind of a win-win situation. They don't even want a neutral situation. They want, we win, Russia loses. And they won't settle for anything else. They are just lusting for that outcome. And so they are angry at Trump for even talking about the possibility of something that's even more like this. Russia succeeds. Now, the only reason Russia would end up succeeding on this, by the way, is because of the pathetic abilities of the entire Western world, to include the previous administration, who rejected every opportunity for a diplomatic solution, which could have left Russia weakened and the Ukrainian side surviving, but still in a good situation. It's certainly at the Istanbul in 2022. We rejected that outcome. We could have prevented the war from coming in, and then it would have been closer to a balance. In fact, the Ukraine side might have been on the top. Because of our fecklessness and our unwillingness or inability to engage in diplomacy, we've lost that chance. Gone, past tense. So I don't care what any of these war lusters want to do now. They can harm us even worse than they have already, because their actions, clearly understand me here, their actions, the people who will be against the war coming to an end, with which shows Russia on the positive end, are the ones that are responsible for the fact that that's the best thing that Trump can get, or anyone could get right now. Because if we don't, and if we keep listening to these people who have been the authors and the writers of this disaster for our side, then it will go from bad to worse, and to potentially much worse. That's what you need to understand here. So even though they will claim, just like all the architects of the Afghan war disaster, from our side specifically, the ones who were responsible for this thing failing are the first ones to continue, by the way, to say that the withdrawal was a mistake. We should have stayed there forever. So they don't recognize their errors, and they want to double down and create deepening error and deepening cost for us. That's what they want to do here too. We'll see how that's going to work out here. But I told you there's some real issues here for Trump. That's the narrow path that he could get it. He compels or coerces Europe and Ukraine to give in to what the minimum acceptable side that the Russian side would have. If he can't, if the European side says, we're not going to underwrite that, we're not going to literally do a 180-degree opposite what we just said yesterday about what we're seeking, all those things Ursula von der Leyen mentioned, and then literally give in on every single one of them. They say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep pressing. Or we might give in on 1 and 2, but not 3, 4, and 5, and 6, whatever their numbers are. And therefore that would fall underneath the minimum that the Russians would have. Ergo, the only path they would have left, according to their perspective, and the power dynamics that exist, is just to keep pursuing the war and keep killing people. And you see on the war, on the front right now, we talked a lot about this penetration north of Pokrovsk here in the last week or so. There was a big penetration by the Russian side. Ukraine side rushed the Azov Corps down to try to contain that. Initially, so far they succeeded. I think it was about an 18 to 20 kilometer penetration the Russians had. It didn't go any further than that. They've actually lost part of it. And now then the Ukraine side has apparently lost a lot of casualties, but they have prevented it from going any further. Russian side has since that time continued on, and that have now eked back out a little bit more of that they had. They still haven't recovered all that they lost after the initial incursion, but for the moment, that side hasn't gone in. But there have been other places on the ground that has. There's just been more movements in the Kupiansk area, in the Donetsk area, and south in the Kherson area. So there have been continued advancements elsewhere, and then now they're chipping back away in here. They did not have an opportunity. I thought they may have exploitation forces available. Either they didn't, they chose not to. I don't know. They didn't do it. That's the bottom line. And that, unfortunately, is given pause to many on the Western side to say, see, Russia's not that strong. We can hold out. In fact, there is some media in the Europe and Ukrainian today that says, yeah, look, when you measure from, I think it's November 2022 till now, they say Russia took maybe 1% additional territory from what they held on that day. After the Ukrainian side retook a lot of that Kharkiv Oblast and the Kherson city and several other areas down there. From that time, they say Russia has only taken about 1%. I haven't seen the numbers. I can't measure them. That seems plausible to me. They probably have. But what they don't talk about is that the massive, massive number of human losses that they have suffered in that time. They don't talk about how the Russian industrial capacity from November 22 is off the charts higher than what it was before. And now that they are producing not just more weapons, but more types of weapons, i.e. the Oreshnik, additional layers of Garin drones, the Garin 2. There's apparently some new jet-powered ones that are starting to come on. They have more maneuverability. They're harder to knock down, and their industrial capacity to produce them is still going to increase, potentially up to 1,000 per day, which is going to be devastating because that's the other area where Russia is advancing, is in the air. And there was a big attack again overnight in Kharkiv and in Odessa. There's been some major damage here right on the eve of this. And of course, Zelensky's already saying, see, this just shows that Russia isn't serious about peace. They're trying to undermine it. No, they're not at all. They're saying we will, they're reiterating what Nebenzia said last May. We will continue to fight. We will not stop on the ground or in the air, but we are wanting to have a negotiated settlement, and we'll stop anytime we come to an agreement. And if we don't come to agreement, these things will continue. You can try and reinterpret them to make Russia sound like more of the evil one, but everybody, or many in the West, already view Russia as the evil one, so there's nothing to gain there. And there's a lot more to lose by not acknowledging reality on the ground. So then, now let's get back to the issues for Trump that he's got to really worry about, is that if he doesn't get that narrow band and he can't get Ukraine or Europe or one or both to his side, now what is he going to do? That is the big question. Maybe the biggest question, why I say this is so high stakes for Trump. Because now then he's going to have to look back to Moscow. He's going to get back on the phone with Putin and say, I couldn't bring him around. I couldn't get him here. Now, Trump has laid a few hints out there with both his comments as well as Vice President J.D. Vance's comments that implying that he could walk away. But that's a really high risk for him too, because then he will be accused by a great many, certainly his political opponents here, but even some of his supporters will say, so wait. So after all this stuff, you're just getting and saying you can solve this in 24 hours. Now you're just going to literally hand it to Vladimir Putin. That's going to be the accusation. They're going to say, you are literally now, I can see this already, you are helping Russia win the war by withdrawing all of our support, by withdrawing all of our personnel, all of our training, all of our intelligence support, etc. You're leaving them out in the cold because the Ukraine side and the European side, they don't have enough wherewithal to fight. Though, according to these reports that I saw earlier today from Ukraine, they will try. They will continue on thinking, well, we've only lost 1% in all these years. We can keep fighting, oblivious to the fact that the core human capital that they have to wage war is just fraying by the day and is about to, could literally just collapse at any moment. It still hasn't so far. But it's just rolling the dice to think that math won't eventually have its toll, because the Russian sides don't have a problem with manpower. That's just recruiting. They could do a forced mobilization. If for some reason they don't get enough people that way, they can start forced mobilization, just like Ukraine's been doing almost since the beginning of the war. So don't get any hope from the fact that Russia may have to go to a mobilization. You should fear that, because now then they don't have to just try to get a few more thousand per month. I mean, they can just bring in another million people if they needed to. People who have some level of military training already, former reservists, etc. So don't find any consolation in that, because that's not good. But Trump will have to face that threat and that charge if he goes down that path. Or his alternative is then to say, okay, well, I can't just walk away because I don't want to be accused of that. So instead, I'll just keep doing it. I'll just keep giving them weapons. I'll keep, all the intelligence stuff. We'll keep doing all that too. That's got a price as well, because our stockpiles, as I've talked about many times and has been talked about openly in the Western press, is very critically low. Our defense industrial capacity, very much in contrast to the Russian side, is not able to replenish losses greater than what they're being used. We're still not even caught up. By most reports I've seen, it will be 5 years once the war ends for us to replace all the categories of things that we're supposed to have in our stockpiles replaced. And then that'll just be getting us back to 2022 levels. Not enough to actually fight a sustained war if we have to get into it with a peer or near peer enemy. So there is a risk that you could further degrade our own national security just because you don't want to face the charge that you're actually helping the Russian side. Meanwhile, on the Russian side, they're prepared for all outcomes. If they get the negotiations that they want, if they say that, then they are willing to end the war. They have motivation to do so because they desire to get beyond the war and to start reestablishing something close to normalized relations with Europe and with the United States, because they know that long term, this is going to be a blip and a piece of a chapter of history, just like so many other wars over the centuries have been. They're looking beyond this as well. Whereas we're not looking beyond anything. We won't even move to the next level, much less looking years down the road like the Russians are. So they do want to end this, and they will end it in negotiation. But they also say what we're not going to do is submit on things that they view as just setting the stage for another level of armed conflict later on by no demilitarization or no denuclearization or no denazification as they view it. So those are things that Russia doesn't want to give into. But here's the thing. Keep going back to this, they don't have to. They can keep going down this military path. Let's say that this situation, this Pokrovsk, shows that Russia doesn't have the ability to really ramrod something down there and have this big operational move, and so they can't go fast. I know one of my colleagues has argued this in war. Who knows? Maybe that's right. I have thought that, no, they have more capacity. They're just not showing it all right now, but if they get push comes to shove, they can. Maybe my colleague is right, and they can't. But they do have the numbers. They do have the industrial capacity. They do have the firepower. They do. And over time, that will have an impact. It's a war of attrition. It's just going to happen that way. Wishful thinking, hoping for a miracle. It's not going to change any of that. And eventually, Russia will get it, whether sooner or later. They will get what they need. We have to make sure we look out for American interests. That is what is expected of the leader of every country. If Emmanuel Macron thinks that it's in France's national interest to fight this, that's something he can figure out. If Keir Starmer thinks that it's worth going into debt to help Ukraine, and that helps somehow Britain, I don't agree with it, but I'm just not my country. My country is the United States, and our country, we do not benefit from a perpetuation of this war or its continuation or its loss by the Ukraine side. That is not in American national interest. Our interest is getting this war over as soon as possible to stop the physical bleeding of the Ukrainian people, to stop the bleeding of our ammunition, weapons, and industrial side that weakens our own national security. That is in our interest. And to keep this from escalating, going beyond. Because as long as the war goes on, there remains the possibility of miscalculation, stupidity, accident, some kind of an error that something happens across some border or something, and all of a sudden people start overreacting, and all kinds of bad things can happen like that. Hasn't happened so far, thank God. But the longer the war goes, the more there's a possibility, and we need to prevent that. That is what is in American national interest. So those are the things that I'm watching for today. Big high stakes meeting with Zelensky here in just a few hours from now with President Trump, and then the one followed by Europeans right after that, about an hour or so later. So I think somewhere around probably 3 or 4 this afternoon, we should probably have a pretty good idea. If possible, we may come back on and give you another show later. But for sure, actually at noon today, we're going to have Colonel Doug McGregor, who's going to give his view on some of this stuff. And we're going to have some information we didn't talk about today about what the American side is going to do. And Doug is going to give information and views like only Doug McGregor has. I promise you don't want to miss that. A little over an hour from right now. Tune in then for the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. See you then.